Okay, why don't we think about getting started? I will come onto video here. And I'm Robert SanGeorge. I'm the person making this presentation. As you can see from the title slide, we are going to be talking about first professionalism and workplace etiquette leading into interviewing. I would invite you to ask questions any time you want, but your microphones are muted. So go to the chat, which I think you should be able to see, and or the Q&A, which I'm not sure whether you can see it. But either way, ask questions in the chat as long as you can see that, and we'll interrupt at any time. If you have a question about something I said on a particular slide and I've moved on to a new slide, just ask that question and I'm happy to go back. Okay, so I want this to be maximally flexible for you. So here we go. This is part of our Career Foundations series. And as you can see, we're going to be talking about professionalism and interviewing, as well as taking a lot of questions. The foundation events, as you see here, are a series of workshops and presentations. And the idea is to bring you at whatever phase you're in as an undergraduate or a graduate student even, to build the essential skills you need for your career path. And each one of these sessions focuses on one of these key areas for building your career foundation. So, and as you can see at the bottom there, that covers a lot of different things, including personal branding and search strategies, resumes and cover letters, of course, and networking and informational interviewing, and then our presentation today. So why are we talking about this at all? Well, interviews are really your first test of professionalism in a workplace. Even if you're doing a Zoom interview or a Microsoft Teams interview, which tend to be the trend these days. I mean, probably 90% or more of the first interviews you do are going to be on Zoom or Teams, sometimes on telephones when people want to use 20th century technology, but that's okay. And the interviews, reflect how you're going to show up at work in terms of how well-spoken you are, how respectful you are, how professional you are in the way you present yourself during the course of an interview. And that shapes how other people see you, as we say here. You can see how many minutes we're dividing up, roughly speaking, for time. And that time will vary depending upon how many questions you ask. And I'm happy to take questions at any time, as I said. So first of all, let's talk about professionalism. And by the way, I come at this from I've been at AU about 15 years as a career advisor, first with School of International Service for a couple of years, and then all the rest of that time since then with the School of Public Affairs. Prior to that, I spent upwards of 20 years in senior executive positions, primarily in the nonprofit sector in the United States, and then actually most of it was in Europe, where I was a senior exec at the international headquarters of World Wildlife Fund. Later on, I was at the United Nations, and after that, I was a consultant to a lot of major employers, and finally returned to the United States, worked at a think tank. But that's enough about me. Let's get to the presentation. Basics of interviewing. Of workplace etiquette. We're not talking about interviewing yet. Arrive on time and leave, and don't leave early. I was about to say leave early. Don't leave early. That may seem like a no-brainer, but I will tell you, my observations have been over a space of a couple of decades. And I'm not talking about really so much here at AU, but I'm talking about prior to that, that I would see people that as interns, not necessarily, observing that, basically treating the time that they are supposed to arrive as sort of a rough idea of when they're supposed to arrive. And if they arrive 15 minutes or half an hour later, that's okay too. Well, it's not really, and people notice that stuff. Depending upon the nature of the employer, they may tell you, hey, after you've been late a couple of times, we really want you to be here on time. Or they may say nothing. It all depends on who's supervising you. But it's for you to make the good impression, because know that If you don't arrive on time and if you leave early, either or, not necessarily both, you are going to be creating a negative impression of yourself. Separate your professional and personal lives to the maximum degree possible. That it is impossible to completely do that. I'm well aware of that, that people's lives sometimes intrude, particularly when you have an urgent family matter that isn't necessarily, someone's gone to an emergency room, can be a lot less than that. But try to separate that out. And we'll be talking a lot about telephones in a moment, because that's where the issue of personal and professional lives integrates a lot. You need to have a positive demeanor as much as possible. Sometimes, particularly when younger undergraduates are doing their first internship in an office, you might tend to be a little anxious or even timid, and that's understandable. But project yourself as positive and not necessarily confident, but at least having a degree of confidence that as you're carrying yourself about the office. Dress in a way that is appropriate to office culture, and take note of that. And that I will talk about that with regard to interviewing. If you don't know what an office culture is when you're interviewing in terms of dress, you should dress in a manner, sort of for males, that's a coat and tie. For women, it is the other appropriate equivalents of that. And don't assume that you can dress casually if you don't know what you've been told about or haven't been told about how to dress. And speak respectfully all the time. You're not back on campus talking to your friends, okay? Where there could be a lot of joking, some of it even a bit edgy joking that we all enjoy. I do too. But you need to speak respectfully to everyone in the office all the time, and particularly to managers and senior executives, but not just them, to really everybody, including fellow interns, if you're an intern in the office. Telephones. Okay, this is an issue, as I mentioned. Some research has shown that the most irritating behaviors in offices, that is, the things that people find irritating about other people in the office, whether they are interns or senior executives or whatever, usually involves telephones. Okay, we're talking about ringing, particularly odd ringtones, but any ringtone is not a good idea. So, as we say, in general, put down your phone and switch it to vibrate. You should only be looking at your phone once you're in an office when you are dealing with things in the office. That is, emails that are coming in the office or texts. But generally speaking, in the office, you probably should be, if you're in an office physically, you should be talking to people face to face. If you're working virtually, then phones have a different issue. So much of what we're talking about here involves your work in a physical office, okay? And for heaven's sake, always silence your phone during meetings. Extremely irritating to be. I've led many meetings in my life, probably in a couple thousand or so, and it is really irritating when phones start ringing. Okay, so vibrating, okay, fine. But then you pick up your phone and you start talking. I don't think so. And something needs to be fairly urgent for you to pick up your phone, answer it, and then walk out of the room to take the call. Okay, that really got to be pretty urgent. And don't start checking your phone. And by that, I mean emails and texts, right? During meetings, let alone social media. All right. You need to be paying attention and looking interested during the meetings. This is professional. This is a positive way to be doing things. And let's talk about work emails. You don't send them with the same kind of highly informal or joking manner you would with your friends. Work emails should be professional. They should usually be in complete sentences. I mean, sometimes you can avoid that, but it needs to be readable, and you need to proofread what you've written so that it won't be misunderstood. Okay? I don't see questions, so I'm just going to keep on rolling. And during meetings, okay, we talked about this a little bit already. Silence your phone when you're coming into a meeting. Okay, you may want to turn it off completely so it's not even vibrating, but certainly at least no ringtones. Appropriate body language is really important during a meeting. And I'll tell you about an experience I had that involves me not doing that. And this was when I was well into my career. I had returned to the United States after working abroad for a long time. And I was working for a consulting firm. And I won't bore you with all the details, but we were having a meeting that was somewhat political in nature. And I was being pushed into working on a project that politically I disagreed with greatly. And I was kind of gritting my teeth because the only option you have when you're assigned to do something like that is you do what you're assigned to do or you quit. And I was not in a position to quit. So during the meeting, which was with, by the way, two former senators who were with us, they didn't work for us, but they were meeting with us about this particular initiative that was rather political, involving legislation in Congress. And at a certain point in the meeting, my boss, who also was the CEO and owner of the firm, passed me a little yellow sticky note, and it said, "Try to look interested." And I thought, oh man, holy cow. I'm showing how bored and unhappy I am with this meeting. So I immediately took her advice. I apologized to her afterwards. She overlooked it, and we went on from there. But that's what you're not going to do when you are in a meeting, okay? And I committed it well into my career. And I mean, I was well into my 40s by then, and should not have been having that kind of a lapse in behavior. But I was pretty politically opposed to what they wanted me to do. The happy ending of that story is that I figured a way to get out of working on that project. I won't bore you with the rest of it, but because I really didn't want to do it. But anyhow, as I say here, upbeat demeanor, look interested, and don't daydream, which I think is probably what I was doing in that meeting I just told you about. And if you're asked to take notes, okay, so imagine that you are an intern and you have seldom or maybe even never been asked to take notes at a meeting. And you're a little, anxious about it because you don't know exactly what they want. Are you supposed to be a stenographer writing down almost everything that's said? What should you do? Well, go to the person ahead of time who is running the meeting. It might just be a few minutes before the meeting starts, and ask them what they expect from the notes you're going to give them, okay? And hopefully they let you, assuming that you type a lot faster than you do cursive writing, hopefully you'll be able to use a laptop without the noise of you hitting the keys, making the typing keys sound very, very distracting. If you are going to do that, and if it's okay with the person who's running the meeting, then try to sit in a place that's maybe at the end of the table, away from a lot of the speaking, but where you can still hear what's going on, obviously. If you're taking notes in handwriting, it's a lot more difficult to keep up. But again, you should have asked the person running the meeting what they expected in terms of how detailed the notes should be, etc. And in what form they expect the notes to be, paragraphed out, in certain ways, and everything is always attributed to who spoke, which is generally an important part of taking meeting notes, etc. So that's a bit about that. If you are going to speak in a meeting, you need to be loud. If you're anxious or a bit timid about what you're going to say, I know that what people do sometimes, and I'm not just talking about interns, I'm talking about people who might be fairly well into their career. They will speak very softly, and not everyone can hear them in the meeting. And you don't want to do that. You also want to be making good eye contact. Now, if you're in a remote meeting, eye contact means one thing. It means the webcam, right? I'm trying to look at the webcam every once in a while, but I do need to look at the screen and what I've written here, because those essentially are my talking points. My suggestion is when you are in a meeting that is remote, Microsoft Teams or Zoom probably, that you take the Zoom screen or the Teams screen and you put it all the way up on your monitor and center it right under the webcam. That way, when you're looking at the people in the meeting, generally speaking, people can't tell the difference, at least hardly at all, between you looking at the webcam and you looking at the people. And it's important that you look at the people so that you're, whatever, little bit of cues you get, you don't get very many body language cues in a remote meeting when, people are looking at you from, from the shoulders up. But you can get facial expressions and things like that. And so make that eye contact remotely. When you're in a physical meeting in the room and you're making a comment, start out by making good eye contact with the person you're mainly addressing, but then shift your gaze occasionally around the room to other people so that they feel like you're talking to them too. Okay, I don't see questions, so I'm going to keep going. Oh, virtual meetings, non-distracting background. Yes, of course. You'll notice I've got, I'm not sitting at a room with the quad behind me. I'm actually home today. And that's a really nice photo that I found of the AU quad, probably in the summertime, I suspect. Yeah, the least you should do, if you have just a blank wall behind you or something like that, I can tell you, because I do one-on-one meetings with students all the time, I have looked at so many unmade beds, I can't count them. And that's okay for a meeting with me. I'm not an employer. I'm not, evaluating you for a job, but that's a complete no-no for a job interview or an internship interview. You would want to at least, there's ways of fuzzying up the background where you don't even have to put background behind you. Or you just shift where it is you're talking from and you've got something non-distracting going on behind you, just like a blank wall, for example, okay? Again, always looked interested, even during virtual meetings, and mostly look at the camera. You can occasionally look in other, you don't have to stare at the camera, and so that it looks like you're hypnotized, but you can, and you can and should occasionally glance elsewhere. But mostly you're looking at a camera during a virtual meeting. Okay, now we're going to talk about deadlines and multitasking. What is the number one thing that most supervisors worry about when they're hiring someone new, especially someone who is entry level, or perhaps you're going for an internship? Are they going to let things fall between the cracks because maybe they're not that well organized? Will they meet deadlines? Can they multitask? Okay. From your perspective, you show up for work, whether, again, internship or job, and you should be asking yourself every morning, what am I going to accomplish today? And look in particular at notes you may have made the evening before as to, or late afternoon, as to, what needs to be dealt with. I have a little tip about, in particular, the thing that people have the most trouble with in terms of staying well organized is an email overload. I mean, that just happens all the time to all of us. And my suggestion is you organize your emails into 3 folders, A, B, and C, 1, 2, 3, however you're going to prioritize them. Things that are urgent need to be dealt with pretty much today, if not immediately, go into the priority 1 folder, drag and drop those emails. Priority 2 emails need to be done within a few days and just can't be forgotten about for long periods of time. Those get dragged and dropped into the number 2 priority folder. The 3 priority folder is everything else, but you should make it a point to look at that lowest priority folder emails once a day to see what you haven't dealt with, and has one of those not very important priorities become much more important over the last several days, okay? So that's a little tip about email. But you've got to show adaptability and flexibility, especially when you're lower on the ladder as an entry-level person or in an internship. Your priorities could change. You may come into the office, or virtually or in person, on a particular day, expecting to do, project number one and priority number two, and your supervisor comes to you and gives you different priorities. And now, if you had previously been given an urgent priority that perhaps your supervisor is not thinking of, it's up to you to proactively say to that person, well, what will I do about this other priority you gave me? Can I know you wanted it today, can I get it done tomorrow? You want to proactively do that. You need to step up and not just assume that because they've given you a couple other things to do, that they're already thinking about your other priorities. You need to make it clear to them what the issue is if you're having a problem with too many urgent deadlines. And that happens to all of us. And I can tell you that for sure. Now, all that said, be as adaptable and flexible as you can, and show initiative and volunteer for things, especially if you're an intern. Volunteering, even for menial stuff. I've heard people who had research internships, they've told me, in important think tanks downtown. And a big meeting was about to happen, and this large conference room where the meeting was going to happen was not properly set up for the meeting. And it's half an hour to the meeting. People are going to begin arriving in 15 minutes. Volunteer to rearrange the chairs. People, that is the staff you're working with, will appreciate that kind of initiative and willingness to do things that aren't necessarily in your job description, okay, or your internship description. Meeting deadlines is important. I want to tell you a little story about meeting deadlines that a student told me once. She was an intern at a place called the National Defense University here in DC, which is, it is a place where people take courses and learn things. It's not a full university in the sense of, thinking of AU, for example. But, and there's a lot of research that goes on there. And she was an intern and working under the supervision of a kind of a mid-level military officer, a major maybe, or a captain. And she was given a research project. And the officer said to her, I'm going to need this by 3 o'clock on Friday. Okay, she said yes. So, she's working on the project. And at about 3:15 on Friday, she hadn't turned it in yet. And guess what? The officer was ducking his head into her office and saying, yeah, you promised me that project 15 minutes ago. And she said, oh, well, I think I can get it done by 5 o'clock. To which he then said, look, when you make, when you agree to a deadline of, let's say, 3 o'clock on Friday, the way we work around here is that means 3 o'clock. It doesn't mean 5 o'clock. And now, not every place is going to be as strict about that as the National Defense University, filled with a lot of uniformed military officers. But when you agree to a particular deadline, you need to make it. And if you see that it's not going to happen because you got too many other priorities, or maybe you were out ill one day, then you need to bring that to the attention of whomever is expecting that project, that whatever it is you're supposed to be doing at that time, whether it's your supervisor or someone else. Okay, I don't see questions. So we're moving into part 2. We're going to talk about interviewing. So how should you look during interviews? I've already talked about this a bit. Always assume you should be wearing business attire if you don't know what the office culture is like. Don't assume that you can dress casually. I mean, the way I'm dressed now is for this interview. In case you can't tell, I've got an AU shirt on for this thing. I thought about, well, should I be wearing coat and tie today? I didn't think I needed to. I didn't think that would matter. But if I were giving a presentation to, higher ranking officials at American University, I'd be wearing a coat and tie. Even they might not be, but I would be. And that's not even a job interview. So during job interviews, I mean, I'll tell you that I actually dismissed someone from a job interview when I was a senior executive at a think tank in DC, later in my career, because he showed up looking like he had just either left the golf course or was about to head to the golf course with, a kind of a golf shirt on. And I think he had, tennis shoes on or something like that. And it wasn't just that. It was obvious to me in the first couple of minutes that he was a bit clueless. And this was an important internship. I was a senior exec, and I was interviewing for people, one of whom was going to be my executive assistant, who really had to be someone on the ball. And the other two people who showed up for the interview were dressed appropriately. This was a coat and tie kind of place. And this guy assumed that either it wasn't or it wasn't important for him to dress appropriately. And that made a really bad impression. Okay. And even if, as these days, your first interview is highly likely to be on Zoom or Teams. If it's on the phone, it doesn't matter how you're dressed, right? But if it's video, it does matter what they're seeing of you from the shoulders up. Okay, so business attire, no distracting jewelry, no loud ties. I've got my favorite tie that I've got, and I hate wearing ties, by the way. It's got a bright yellow background, and it's got a map of the Manhattan part of the New York City subway system on it. I bought it at the Amtrak station in Penn Station in New York once when I was killing time in this great little tie place. And I love this tie. I like to wear this tie, but I would never wear it for a job interview. It's loud, it's distracting, and somebody could be put off by it rather than being amused by it. Okay, so and it doesn't have to be. I mean, that's a really distracting tie. Wear something conservative. In generally speaking, in terms of your overall attire, when you're doing an interview. Especially, and that includes, by the way, if they can only see the upper part of your body. Remember that, all right? You are upbeat and energetic every moment. I learned very early on when I'm training people for interviewing, which I do quite frequently, that some people think, well, the first interview is just a phone interview and it's only 15 minutes. So it's not that important. Yes, it is very important because that's going to determine whether you get a more complete interview with the person who's going to be your supervisor. And it's really important that you are upbeat and energetic every moment and that you are conveying it in your tone of voice. And particularly for a phone interview, because you're doing a phone interview, what are they going on? They're not looking at you. They're looking at your resume. They're looking at your cover letter. But you need to be upbeat and energetic, kind of the way I'm displaying myself during this presentation. Maybe not quite that much. I realize some of you might not be comfortable doing that, but that's what you got to do. And then if you're in a Zoom or Teams interview, that should come across in terms of your facial expressions. But avoid, hand gestures. The only way to make hand gestures when you're on Zoom or Teams, unless you're really pulled back, is you're going to bring your hands way up high. Don't do that. Not a good idea. And it's distracting. Okay. And it's not, one thing I want to make clear, it's not normal to be upbeat and energetic every moment of a 15-minute or half-hour interview, but you need to do that. It's a little bit of an acting job. And most of us don't have much training in acting, but you just need to, come up with that. Eye contact. Okay, if you're in a physical room, and let's say you're being interviewed by 3 people, your answer to a question starts out looking at the person who just asked you the question. But you're moving your gaze during the course of answering, during a 45-second answer or minute answer to a question, you're moving your gaze to the other 2 people or the other person or whomever in the room. If it's just one person interviewing you, and again, if you're physically there, yes, you should be looking at a person in the eye, but don't do it the whole time. They're wondering why you're kind of glomming onto them with your eyes. You can look away, all right, whatever is natural. Now, online, whole different thing. There is only one eye to make contact with, and it is the single, webcam. Again, I'm going to mention what I mentioned before. Bring the Zoom or Teams screen up to the top of your monitor. Center it right under the webcam, and that way you can look at the person. And the webcam, the difference between where their face is and where the webcam is might be just that much. And it's hard for them to tell if you're not looking, that you're looking at them and not directly looking at the webcam. Uh, and occasionally look aside, but you've got to maintain good eye contact. Really important. Smile whenever appropriate, okay? And smile periodically whenever possible. If you're making some really serious point about a serious issue that this employer deals with and they've asked you about it, smiling might seem odd. Like, why is she smiling when she's talking about this, uh, uh, you know, um, trafficking in children globally, working for a refugee relief organization, something like that. But so you want to smile whenever appropriate for this reason. You are presenting yourself as a user-friendly person, someone they would like to have around the office when you're in the office, someone they'd like to be dealing with online when you're working, remotely. So smiling periodically is important. It's the Goldilocks principle. Not too much, not too little, just right. Okay. Hand gestures, I already talked about that. So, and I don't see questions. If you got questions about that slide, ask them. I realize I moved on quickly here, and I've got to adjust something so I can read everything that I wrote here. Setting up for virtual interviews. Okay, this is sort of what I call the performance art of Zoom and Teams. All right, proper lighting. Don't just rely on a window unless it's, where I am here in DC, it's bright and sunny, and the windows that I have, which are floor to ceiling, face east, which means I'm getting a lot of sunlight right now, and I actually have to blot out some of it so I'm not squinting. But late in the day, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, the sun will be gone. Still might be sunny, but the sun will be somewhere else. And also in the wintertime, 4 o'clock starts to get dark, right? So you may think about the lighting and think about whether you should be supplementing with a lamp. Now, what is that lighting going to be? Overhead is really great if you're in a room that's got overhead lighting. Otherwise, the lamp should be to the side of you. Don't put lighting in back of you. It tends to obscure your face, sometimes to the extent that it looks like you're in some sort of witness protection program. If you've ever seen those media interviews where they're interviewing somebody who's in hiding and they want to obscure their face, the easiest way they do that is to put lighting behind the person, and it darkens their face tremendously. No distracting noise. If you're doing, particularly if you're doing a job or internship interview, and you share housing with people, you're in a 3-bedroom apartment or whatever, make sure the other people know, don't disturb me, and don't make noise, and don't start playing loud music, etc. And make sure you got that under control. Again, the background behind you must not be distracting, whether it's real or virtual. You need to have reliable Wi-Fi, really important. I know that's a problem for some people. If you've got an important interview coming up for an internship or a job, and your Wi-Fi is not reliable, and you are going to be at home during that interview, then maybe think about going somewhere on campus. And I don't mean a coffee shop like Starbucks where it's noisy. I mean one of those rooms in the library, the main library, that you can reserve and close the door, and maybe even put up a little sign on a piece of paper that says, job interview, 3 p.m. to 3:30, please do not disturb, something like that, okay? But you need to be where your Wi-Fi is reliable, because the worst thing that can happen is that, the Wi-Fi doesn't work, and then you got to, or they keep missing things that you're saying, and then the interviewer says to you, well, this has been okay, thank you very much. And it's quite possible that the lack of reliable Wi-Fi blew apart your interview. Now, sticky notes around the outside of the monitor. What am I talking about here? When you're doing a remote interview, make use of the fact that you're remote and they can't see everything about you. Again, put that Zoom screen or Microsoft Teams up at the top of the monitor, shrink it a bit, and center it under the webcam, and then around, in a kind of a U shape around the screen of Zoom or Teams, you can put yellow sticky notes, either real ones on your screen, or there's some people have software. There may even be freeware to have electronic yellow sticky notes. And what I'm talking about here is putting 3- and 4-word talking points on those yellow sticky notes for questions that you can anticipate. I'm going to be talking about those questions in a moment. One of them will be, what do you hope to be doing after you graduate? Or what do you hope to be doing in 3 years or 5 years? Hopefully the answer is roughly the same. And you want to plan out what you're going to say there. Don't get into a detailed answer so that you're going to have to lean in and squint to read what you wrote on the sticky note. I'm talking about 3 or 4 words written fairly large so that you can, be at a normal distance from the monitor, and you've got your memory jolt, I call it. Oh yeah, I want to say this when they ask me that, and do it for every answer you can anticipate. I have gotten feedback from students a lot regularly that it is extremely helpful to, especially if you're someone who gets really anxious and nervous about interviewing. Okay, so sticky notes, yes, use them when you're doing remote interviews. So again, your approach to any kind of interview, did I say you should be energetic and upbeat? I think I did. But try to project an aura of confidence and decisiveness in the way you answer questions. Generally, if you're upbeat and energetic, that will probably come through. If you're there physically, make sure your posture is straight. I've been trained to read body language. I've been trained both in Europe and in the United States. And for Americans, okay, this can be different, particularly when you're in other cultures. Some European countries, a lot of African countries, and most Asian countries. But in the United States, if you're in a conversation, whether it's an interview or whatever, if you are leaning forward slightly, the way I am, I might be leaning forward too much, but leaning forward slightly, for most of the time when you're being interviewed, what it says to the other person, even if they're not trained to read body language, and 98% of people are not, is I am engaged and interested in the conversation. That's what leaning forward slightly does. If you're kind of leaning back like this, obviously it's passive, it's no good. If you're military ramrod straight, that can be okay, but they may think you're a little bit, unfriendly, maybe. And if you're leaning in too far, and I'm talking now mainly about in physical interviews, in-person interviews, that can be viewed as aggressive or just inappropriate, okay? So leaning forward slightly should be your default posture most of the time, not necessarily every moment of the interview. And you've got an animated tone of voice, okay? Practice, interview practice giving decisive and confident answers. Generally speaking, depending on the nature of the question they ask, your answers are going to be somewhere between 30 and 90 seconds long, even for a more complicated question. Think about every one of your answers as being a takeaway message. What is the most important takeaway message from where do you hope to be in 3 years or after you graduate? Okay. What's the one takeaway message you want them to type or handwrite into their notes? And here's the reason why. Let's say 3 people are interviewing for the position that you have applied for, and you have no control whether you're the first or the last. And let's say you're the first. That means that the interviewer's memory of you is going to be the foggiest compared to the other 2 people, right? So if you think about your answers as having a message, that will help them write their notes, actually, and they will remember, oh yeah, when I asked her this, she said that. That is your objective in terms of the way you were talking about yourself. Now, if they ask you, tell me about what you think your strengths are for this position, which is a very common question, there are probably more than one takeaway message. There could be 2 or 3. But you want to know what those are, and you want to plan that out ahead of time for that kind of question, because it's asked a lot. And I already talked about the memory jolts on sticky notes. So questions that are always asked, you may wonder about. And speaking of which, I don't see any questions here. So in a first round interview, and by that I don't mean a phone interview where someone, usually a human resources officer, is asking some very basic stuff of you, and it might only last 10 minutes. I'm talking about a significant interview, usually on Teams or Zoom, possibly in person, but usually not, where they're typically talking to you for at least 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, sometimes an hour. Usually for an internship, not an hour, but for an entry-level job, it could be. And the first question often, well, actually, the first question often is, so Jim, so Jane, tell me about yourself. All right. I didn't put that down in this slide. And probably if you've interviewed before, you've had that experience. If when you're asked that question, the tell me about yourself question, do not treat it as an opportunity to talk about how you like to ride bicycles and cook or whatever it is you like to do in your free time. Turn that into a question, an answer in which you spend 20 seconds, maybe half a minute maximum, talking about where you came from and what you're studying now as an undergraduate or graduate student. But then you are transitioning into, tell me about yourself. You're transitioning into talking about saying, and as a result of the background I've had and other internships I've had and my studies, I believe I'm a really strong fit for this position because, and then you want to mention a couple of reasons why you're a strong fit for the job, even though they haven't asked it, okay? But what is the point here? You are marketing yourself from the first question onwards, even if it's a tell me about yourself question, okay? Now, going past that, usually the next question is, why are you interested in working for us? And then, why are you interested in this specific internship or job? Oftentimes, those two questions are asked simultaneously, and they combine the question. And you definitely need to have an answer in mind. You can anticipate that question. You should know what you want to say, and you might want to have a little memory jolt, sticky note on your screen as to what it is you're going to say in response to that. Okay. And again, it could be, where do you expect to be in 3 to 5 years, or where do you expect to be when you graduate? I mentioned this already. If they didn't ask the tell me about yourself question, or if you don't feel you handled it that well, then when they ask, tell me about your strengths for this position, which is a very common question, you've got at least 2 strengths that you can talk about that, hopefully persuade them that you merit serious consideration for the internship or job that you have applied for. Now, the dreaded weakness question is what I call it. Oftentimes, this is not asked of people interviewing for internships. It's more often asked of people interviewing for jobs. But nonetheless, you want to be ready for it. Because if you are not ready to cite a weakness for this internship or job, and you try to handle it on a fly, you will usually fail. On the fly, I mean, on a fly. You will usually fail and kind of meander around a little bit. I advise that if you're trying to plan what to say, by the way, sometimes this question is asked as, what do you think your most significant challenge would be? That's a more polite way of asking that question, less confrontational. Same answer though, I mean, whatever. You look at the internship or job description. Is there a certain piece of software that you need to use in the job that you haven't used before? You may want to say, well, as you may note from my resume, I don't have experience using software X. However, if I may say so immodestly, I learn new software really well and fairly quickly, and I would welcome the opportunity to get trained up in that software very early on, so that in my first few days in this internship or job, I will hit the ground running. So what have you done? You've turned that question into a positive thing about how excited you are to learn this new software and how you learn it quickly and you want to hit the ground running. If you can't talk about software, you might talk about a certain aspect of the subject matter that you're going to be dealing with. Let's say you are interviewing for a really good internship at one of the big foreign policy think tanks in DC, and you're going to be doing research in a number of places with regard to a number of regions of the world, and an answer to this weakness question might be, well, you may note that I don't have much background in the history and the culture of Kazakhstan. However, if we reach an agreement on me being hired, I would welcome the opportunity for you and your colleagues to send me as much information as they think is relevant and important, either in terms of online links or email attachments, so that I can read up on this aspect of this project you're doing in Kazakhstan, and I can hit the ground running in the first few days on the job. Again, that hit the ground running early is something employers like to hear. So that's how to answer that weakness question. And be prepared to ask one or two thoughtful questions, so that when they say to you late in the interview, and they will, do you have any questions for me or for us? You've immediately got something you want to ask, and you've written down on a sticky note what that question is, and you may have two questions. A question I often suggest that people ask is, I would like to know, what are the most significant challenges people have faced in their first few weeks in this position previously? That strikes the interviewer as a thoughtful question. It's important that your questions are part of your marketing yourself for the position, so that they're thinking, that's a thoughtful question. They may even say it out loud, but that's a thoughtful question. Let me tell you what I think about that. And so have one or two questions ready to go, maybe only one question ready to go, and maybe the other question is something that's come up during the interview that you want to ask them about. But this is not an opportunity to say, oh, what's the next step? When will I hear from you again? That is when you realize that the session's just about over. They're about to end the session on Zoom or Teams, or they're about to usher you out of the room physically, more likely Zoom or Teams, and they will probably tell you, well, we'll get back to you by the end of the week, or we'll get back to you early next week. But it's up to you to ask them that if they haven't said it, okay? How do you get help with interviewing? The AU Career Center website, which is american.edu/career center, okay, has a number of suggestions. But aside from that, use glassdoor.com to research the types of questions that generally you will find in glassdoor.com are asked by major and medium-sized employers. So you go to glassdoor.com. I'm not going to explain to you how to find the section where people post content about what they were asked in a job interview with a particular employer, and you can go to that and benefit from their wisdom. But there's an important catch here. It's very easy to start looking at what someone says about the interview they had with an employer and to realize, oh, wait a minute, they interviewed for a different job or a different kind of internship. Make sure we're talking about the same kind of job or internship that you interviewed for, okay? I myself have made that mistake easily, because you're just trying to go through stuff quickly, okay? You can get interview help from AU Career Advisors, whatever school you're with. If you're with the, well, let's talk about it this way. If you're in the Kogod Business School, there is a Kogod Career Center. If you're in SIS, they have their own advisors. If you are in any of the other AU schools, there is a team of advisors who have specific assignments to various schools. Mine happens to be School of Public Affairs. I deal with seniors and graduate students, sometimes younger students. But in any case, you can get interview prep help from those people, as well as potentially doing a mock interview if you can get an appointment with the advisor before your actual interview is taking place. And if it's urgent, if you're having trouble getting an appointment before a big interview is coming up, email the career advisor, or phone the AU Career Center front desk, 202-885-1804, 202-885-1804, and tell them, I'm having trouble getting help on an interview, and I really need to do a mock interview, or at least get some advice from a career advisor before I do this interview. And they'll do the best they can to set up someone on short notice. Also, there is something called Big Interview on Handshake. Big Interview is, well, it's not on Handshake. You reach it via Handshake, I should say. If you go into Handshake, on the main menu on the left side, there's a bunch of links there, and there's a link called Resources. You click on that, and then you will find Big Interview there. You go into Big Interview, it's a whole software platform unto itself, and you can figure out pretty intuitively, because it's quite intuitive the way that it's set up, and you can get it to ask you questions that are asked for specific kinds of jobs and or internships. And then when you answer those questions, you record yourself answering the questions, and most people tend to be their toughest critics, which is a good thing, generally speaking. So that's another way of getting interview help. Okay. So again, anybody got questions? And while I am waiting for you to think about that for a moment, I just want to tell you about upcoming events. Handshake, you can find jobs and internships there. You can get help with interviews, as I mentioned, and register for events, etc. You can make appointments online, that is, make appointments with career advisors, which are either in person or online, but you make the appointment on Handshake. If you don't know how to do that, you contact the AU Career Center front desk. We do drop-in advising, that is, you don't have to make appointments, Monday through Thursday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Okay, every one of those 4 days, and there is a career advisor waiting for you. You can connect with us in a lot of different ways. I want to mention, this is kind of my own little promotion, that I maintain a Twitter account. I don't want to call it X. I think I never liked that name. I thought it was stupid. But anyway, I maintain a Twitter account in which I tweet every month about 100 to 125 internships, all but a handful are paid, that are relevant to people in the School of Public Affairs, which is my responsibility. I also tweet 125 or more jobs, full-time jobs, primarily entry-level. If they're not entry-level, they don't require more than 1 or 2 years of experience. And if you've got most people can argue they have a year's experience based on internships they've done by the time they're seniors. And I'm going to give you the address. I'm going to put it in the chat right now so you can write it down or copy and paste it. So it's at AU_SPA careers. It's a private account. You can, what can you do? You go to that account. It'll say tweets are protected. Click follow. You click follow. That sends me a note that via Twitter that you have requested access. If your Twitter handle does not resemble your name, which means I can't tell whether or not you are an AU student or recent alum, then you've got to email me and tell me that you've asked for access and tell me what your handle is that doesn't resemble your name. I don't make any judgments about Twitter handles. And I've also just tweeted my email address that you can use. I'm probably not going to, well, we still got a little bit of time. It doesn't look like anybody has asked questions. So upcoming events, let's see, on October 24th, which is in a couple of days, right? There is LinkedIn for Beginners. A colleague of mine will be doing that. There's going to be a resume one-on-one session. That's primarily designed for mostly first-year students. Could be, you might be a sophomore and need that kind of help. Search strategies, particularly for more advanced internships and also getting into the job world for juniors and seniors. There is another Resume 101 on November 5th. There's going to be a pretty good session on careers in Congress on November 12th. And just to move this around here, whoops, sorry. Oops, I went to a different slide and I didn't mean to do that. National security and the intelligence community. There is going to be both a workshop and a networking reception on November 18th. If you are interested in national security and the intelligence community, you want to be there. I think it's usually around 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., maybe 4 p.m. You're going to have to look for that. It doesn't have, none of these actually have the hours on them. But you can find them all in Handshake in the events area, okay? So that's that. It doesn't look like I see any other questions. So, and it's 12:58. So I'm going to sign off. Thank you for your attention. And if you wanted to get in touch with me about the Twitter account, I welcome you to do that. And we go from there. So I wish you good evening or good afternoon and good luck.